morning and welcome to the third in our trilogy of the webinar as we look at before Corona, during Corona, and now we're looking ahead to after Corona. I'm Paul Dupuis, the Managing Director and CEO of Randstad India. Thank you to all of you who have come to this webinar today from across borders. We have people from 7 or 8 countries, of course, a large representation from right here in India. Well over 500 people joining us today, so thank you. And thank you to many of you who have joined us in the past. Very pleased to welcome back our panelists who have been with me on 2 webinars now. First, Professor Raghunath from the India Institute of Management here in Bangalore. He's a professor of strategy and he's the chairperson for the Center for Corporate Governance and Citizenship at IIMB. More than 3 decades of experience as a strategy implementation consultant, as a senior leadership team coach, and he's been on an independent board, member of banks, venture capital, and on corporate boards as well. Professor Raghu, welcome back.
Thank you.
And we also have Vinay Kumar. Vinay is the founding director at C2C OD. That's an organizational development consulting firm. Vinay has held leadership positions, as CXO in the services, education, banking industries. For the last 12 years, he's been working with organizations and the C-suite and helping increase effectiveness and making sure talent development activities are aligned with organizational strategy. Vinay is also the current global chair of the International Association of Facilitators. Welcome back, Vinay.
Thanks, Paul. Hi, everyone.
So here we are. 6 weeks ago, we held our first webinar where we talked about leading in crisis, and we answered a lot of questions from leaders on the webinar about what is really necessary when we talk about leadership to steer a ship through ambiguity and adversity. And I think we all realize that this is quite new for us. While many of us have been through different crises in our career, whether it was 9/11, whether it was the GFC, I talked about in my case, I was in Japan for the earthquake and the tsunami and the nuclear meltdown that happened. There is a common thread, a common denominator. Leaders need to show calm, confidence, but also need to manage expectations. We talked about pragmatic optimism, the Stockdale paradox, from good to great, and so on. So we learned a lot about leadership during crisis. Then we moved forward into what are some of the challenges we're facing in an extended crisis like the one we're in right now, and some of the issues around wellness. Of course, engagement is very important, connectivity, but also wellness. And a lot of you asked questions about mental health and how to handle this, particularly as we face an extended lockdown around the world, the ambiguity which continues. And of course, there's a fear there as well about the rebound of the virus. Will we actually defeat this, or will this be around? And here we are kind of moving into the next phase, and we see it around the world with some countries already opening up. We're talking about after the crisis, and I don't think the virus will ever really truly go away. The common thought now in the WHO is also starting to state that we will have to find a way to live with this virus and manage it, and that kind of brings a whole new list of challenges for all of us. So hey, the situation continues to be fluid, changes rapidly. We continue to be challenged as leaders, and now it's talking about a new world. There is a lot of talk about the new normal, and Professor Raghu, we hear this phrase, new normal, and I would argue that it's not so much a new normal, it's a new world, it's a new era, it's a new way of interacting, it's in a way a new way of living. I'd like to get your thoughts on this new world that we're moving towards.
Absolutely, Mr. Paul. Thank you very much for setting the tone for the discussion. As you rightly said, it's not a new normal. It's a complete new abnormal. I would call it the COVID bombshell. Is the screen visible?
Yeah,
yes, Mr. Paul? Is it? Yeah. So it's like the new bombshell which has torn the society into smithereens, and all of us are running for cover. And if we look at organizations, they've had an issue, and that issue is primarily one of actually creating a set of paratroopers all over the place. People have done their exits, they are there in their homes, and we are trying to manage the entire ecosystem. So they have landed in a territory where the enemy is unseen, and organizations are having their command centers with their leaders wherever they are. They give the macro picture, and the paratroopers, the troops on the ground, the colleagues around, they are the ones who actually see reality as it is. So it's a situation which we have never thought about before. It is a situation which requires and which is based on seamless connectivity, but it's all about exchange of information, high level as well as the micro level information. Obviously, it is based on secure access, and team collaboration and productivity trackers are the norm of the game. And that's the way the whole thing moves. So where we are today is very different from where we were designed to be. We were involved in a hierarchical structure. Every one of us had very fixed roles, and there were expectations. But what we are experiencing now is a very dynamic situation where we are actually trying to augment our value through means and ways and processes which we have never thought about before. In other words, this is a world which is now being built on redundancies, into redundancies in supply chain, into looking at alternate sources, redundancies in terms of what could happen to the health and welfare and the well-being of people involved, both in technical and delivery teams. So these are indeed unusual times, Mr. Paul.
Professor Raghu, thank you so much. COBIT bombshell is an interesting way to frame this. Absolutely, it came out of nowhere. I mean, most of us on this webinar today, we were working as business as usual one day, and 2 or 3 days later, the world was turned upside down as we went into this lockdown mode, something completely unfamiliar to us. I really liked your analogy of paratroopers as well. Just one reflection before I go to you, Vinay, on this. What I've seen with organizations that I've spoken to and leaders, the military response to a crisis has been very appropriate for the current situation. In fact, many companies have turned to the military as an example, to leaders with military backgrounds. I can tell you that those retired officers that are out there in corporate India and beyond right now are really stepping up and living the values and showing the way on how to handle a crisis like the one we're in right now. So it's a very interesting analogy that you make. Vinay, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think it's great. And I like the concept of the COVID bombshell and the fact that we're moving away from this new normal. There is, in fact, the normal that we had, we'll have the opportunity to be nostalgic about it. I was talking to someone and they were nostalgic about even traffic jams in a city like Bangalore. But I think in terms of your question was what the new world ahead, right? I think the new world ahead is really going to focus on, I hope, looking at some of the positives. There's been a great surge of human compassion. There's been a lot of surge of people helping each other out. There's a lot of surge of teams in organizations connecting with each other. And there was a great chart the professor had about connectivity. We've shown what connectivity virtually can do. It's about leveraging this and taking this ahead to the next level and continuing with it as well. So I don't think we'll ever go back to what was the old normal. We'll have a next wave of new ways of working that we need to figure out. And I think we've started that process already.
Yeah, and I think you're right, Vinay, when you look at what's happening in some countries, even as, for example, schools reopen in some countries, we're seeing a whole different approach to education. Whether it's the protocols around entering the school to stay sanitized, keep the students safe, to the way they're seated in the school itself, the hybrid version of learning, the interactive learning face-to-face versus a virtual learning. All of these lessons actually we can apply now to the work environment, the world of work. So let's talk about that next. And that's really the key topic for today. Is about the world of work, the future of work. What will work look like in this new world? And what are your thoughts on this? Professor Raghu, can we go back to you to start?
Yes. So continuing with the earlier dialogue which we had on redundancy, one of the things that we obviously are looking at is a changed organizational reality where we had talent in abundance and we had enough sales and surplus. But there are companies nested in industries where if they are servicing human conduct in terms of delivering in a remote place and actually promoting remote services and making sure that the human being doesn't have to be mobile. So if something is going to reduce or eliminate mobility, and which is going to strengthen remote access, those are the companies which are going to see an upsizing in terms of talent and the kind of work that they would do. On the other hand, there are a whole host of such industries which is dependent on human presence and human interaction. And those probably will face downsizing, shutting down. But the best silver streak in the dark clouds that we see is a whole host of companies which are coming up with their reserves and surplus to engage talent along with technology and innovating in new ways in terms of process engagements. In other words, technology is impacting talent reconfiguration. There are a whole set of algorithms, whole set of apps which are actually enhancing human capabilities available within organizations. While on the other hand, there are a set of workflows which have now been automated, which are so repetitive that they are replacing human talent. So it is a heady mix of what's going on in terms of enhancing talent, and therefore a whole lot of talent reconfiguration is going to happen going out into the future, where HR will have immense scope for rotating talent, for making sure that talent is fungible in ways in which it can learn, relearn, and deliver the kind of value that customers are looking for in terms of promoting remote locations and making sure there is contactless value. Thank you.
Thank you. A lot of powerful points in there, which we're going to revisit later in some of the questions that have come up on those topics. Thank you, Professor Raghu. Vinay, what are your thoughts?
I'm just going to move it a little bit more to a higher level in terms of what is the expectation of employees and in organizations. And I know, Paul, you've got your book coming out on the E5, but I'm going to throw out a new one, which is the 5 C's here. From all the organizations I'm talking to and the employees in them, I'm seeing employees ask for greater clarity in direction. They want to know, how is the organization going to pivot? What is their product and service portfolio going to look like? So they want a lot of clarity from their leaders. They want communication, constant. They want updates, they want to be frequent. So that's the second C. The third is, as we get back to work, they're seeking a lot of compassion. Not everyone is ready to get back to work. I know of several employees in various organizations, their kids, as you mentioned earlier, their kids can't go to school yet. And they've got 2 kids working off 1 laptop. And if mom or dad goes off to the office, they don't have access to that laptop yet. So they're looking for organizations to be compassionate in this. They want organizations to keep building community. That's the 4th C. This connectedness, the feel, the identity. I mean, you're wearing your company shirt, I am wearing mine, but we've missed the corporate space with our logos and our artifacts that create that community. And the last one is care. Care around hygiene, care around safety, care around employee services. So a lot of expectation of employees is, okay, we're ready to go back to work in physical if needed, but what's the care? What are the systems that have been put in place to care for us? So I would say those 5 C's is what I'm hearing show up in terms of preparedness to go back from home.
Thanks, Vinay. All right, so following the E5, my book that's coming out, I'll start thinking about a framework for C. I would add one that's very important from a leadership standpoint. As the CEO of a large, complex organization that covers the 4 corners of India, we have well over 50 locations across the country, crossing cultures, crossing red, orange, and green zones in terms of this crisis. I can tell you that absolutely compassion is important. Being connected and being compassionate, being in the moment, genuinely caring is one big one for me. You know, we spend so much time in front of this screen now. What's interesting, while we're not face to face, we're actually connecting in a way on a deeper level. I'm learning about colleagues across the 4 corners of Randstad, things about them I never knew, and these are people I worked with side by side. And it often comes from incidental things, like, for example, when you're sitting in your room and someone behind them has something on the wall, and in many cases it's notes from their children or it's a piece of artwork and there's a story behind it. You really start to connect with people when you start to talk about these things. So connected and compassionate. I think there's one more C, Vinay, which I'm hearing from leaders. Tough decisions. So the C is courage. This situation calls for a high level of courage, probably more than ever, because we have to make tough decisions with the view, with the aim, the mission, I would say. If we go back to the military example, the mission to protect, defend, and future-proof our organizations. There are tough decisions ahead, and we see that, of course, when we pick up the newspaper every day with companies that are making decisions on their people. And we'll also talk a little bit about that later on. You know, I was this crisis has given me, and I know you fellas as well, lots of opportunity to read. And I've done a lot of reading. I look back at, you know, I'm a big believer you learn from history. Futurism is often learning from what happened in the past and applying that to the future, right? In the Spanish flu in 1918, 1919, we saw a very interesting, you know, sort of evolution of how that came about, how the world handled it, and how the world bounced back. And maybe some real lessons there for us to learn. One of those is that going into lockdown mode is the right thing to do. This is what humans do. It's fight or flight, and this is the moment to lock down and contain this thing that we don't understand. The mistake, let's say, we can say in hindsight, that was made was they bounced back quickly and opened up the world quickly. And of course, we know what happened with the rebound. So those courageous decisions need to be made based on facts, made based on objective data, but also based on opinions of experts. So it's very important now as leaders that we continue, while we are compassionate, we continue to lean towards the objective, towards the logic-based decisions, and we'll call that factfulness. One more point, and something I read, very interesting. We talk about Darwinism. We often hear about Darwinism of being survival of the fittest. But if you read a little bit more deeply on what Charles Darwin said, he actually said that the organized natural selections favors people or communities or tribes that are agile and flexible. So actually, it's not always the strongest who survive, it's the most adaptable. And I would say from an organizational standpoint, this is a very important lesson for us all. How adaptable we will be, how agile will we be in order to be prepared for the future. And so I would say this is a very important quality now for all leaders as we move forward to this new world of work. Hey, gentlemen, I'd like to ask you a question about what the new workplace is going to look like. We've seen lots of interesting examples, and I know the three of us, we've been sharing different things that we've seen from organizations around the world. Anything you'd like to share on, you know, just how a workplace may look and how it may change in this new world?
Well, I can jump in. I think one thing I'm hearing, and I'm leveraging best practices and what we're seeing from countries that have already gone back to work, right? But be it Korea or China or even Australia, where I have colleagues who've gone back. So one is fewer people in the workplace in terms of actually the workplace, but work doesn't stop. Work is no longer defined by a place. Work is defined by output. So it's an outcome-based productivity, not the number of hours you put in. A lot more connected with clients, for those of us who've got client-facing. In fact, to your point, Paul, I think people are building, this has been an opportunity to build stronger and deeper connections with clients and customers. And anybody who's not done that, you're probably given an opportunity for others to do it. So I think it's greater connectedness, work defined by no longer by location. Even the talent pool is no longer defined by which office you're sitting out of. Most of my clients saying we can hire from anywhere now, right? So it's completely redefining. It's actually breaking certain biases that we held. So it's creating new ways of working. That's what I would say.
Yeah. And there's the agility element that's going to come into this. Professor Raghu, what are your thoughts on how the new workplace will look like?
Yeah, so the new workplace is where you are, that is where you work, which is very different from we head to a place which is physically located. It's a geographical space. So there is a spatial element which has undergone tremendous change in terms of a definition, which also means tremendous adjustment in the mental space of people, the mental and the emotional space of people. I think work happens, as you know, at three levels, physical being the utmost external, and mental is what, and emotionally what you feel when you go through this. And I think the biggest change in terms of place is about the preponderance now of the mental and the emotional rather than the physical, because physical is, as you said, it's constrained. It's what happened many years ago when there was some similar pandemic, and you are pretty much constrained. But what probably needs to be unconstrained, to be unfettered, and which is likely to be under lockdown, is the mental and the emotional frame. And as leaders, I think you are the ones who will charge people up when you sit up and every morning when you do a all hands call. The all hands has to go all the way to all hearts and all minds, which always think about a better tomorrow in spite of the challenges, and the kind of data which comes from the world is not very, very encouraging. So I guess it is more the mental and the emotional space rather than a very physical workplace.
Yeah, that's a very good point, Professor Raghunath. Thank you, Vinay, as well. I can, again, speaking as a CEO, nowhere in my job description did it say that I was going to be, inspiring my colleagues across the four corners of India by video conference, and that would be my workplace. I mean, if I look at my job description now, it's certainly changed a lot. But one thing hasn't changed is we need to provide direction, inspiration, as you said, the North Star. What is our true north? That needs to be expressed. And Vinay, you talked about it earlier. I think communication is so critical right now, so critical that we communicate even more, because in ambiguity and adversity, people need to know what's happening, need to know where we're going. And even if we don't have a crystal ball, at least we can say we've got a firm hold on the wheel and we're moving forward, and we'll move forward together. I think that sense of confidence is absolutely critical, particularly in crisis. Let's move to questions. We got a lot of questions from the audience coming into today's session, probably the most ever, in fact. And so I've got a bunch here, and we'll share them with you both, and look forward to hearing your ideas. So this is I'm going to club two questions together. Richa Pandey, the CPO of Inatech, as well as Purushottam, the CEO of a company called K7 Antivirus. Oh, interesting. The question is, how would the HR role get redefined as a result of this crisis? You know, work from home has become the new reality. TCS, for example, is talking about 75% of employees working from home permanently by 2025. We're hearing about a lot of the positives of working from home, a lot happening by networking, collaboration. Most of this is obviously an informal setting, it's intangible. Then it brings up questions of career progression. It makes us rethink, and Vinay, of course, you as an organizational development expert, how this will play out for organizations that continue to grow and for people to develop their career. On a similar note, what are the changing priorities for HR and HR leaders in terms of people management post the lockdown? So I've clubbed two questions together in there, and it's really around the role of the HR leader and how it's redefined moving forward in this new world. So we'll start with Vinay. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think, we've always talked about HR speaking the language of business, but that has never been as true today as ever before. So the more HR has to be aligned to business that's pivoting in terms of offerings, it's business. So HR's role is going to be creating the most agile workforce that can move with how the business evolves. The second scale that's going to be critical for HR, engagement, helping leaders engage with teams that are distributed, that are virtual, that are stay connected. And third, it's that compassion and caregivers, right? Compassion, community, and care. Those three become much more centered into the role. The transactional element of doing performance reviews and all of that, that's going to reduce, in my opinion. I think HR's expectation is help the workforce be as agile as possible and focus on compassion, community, and care. And that's going to be the new, and do it with the business reality in mind. Yeah,
well said. I mean, I absolutely, I think the role of HR has changed already over the years, especially in recent years, Vinay. Become much more strategic. I've talked about this in past webinars. As a leader, I want two key people by my side. Of course, all my leaders are important around me, but I want my CFO on one side and my CHRO on the other side. and they help identify blind spots. They bring things to the table that I need to know. They bring perspective, and they need to be commercial, strategic, and human-centric advisors. Professor Raghu, what are your thoughts on the role of HR moving forward?
Yeah, so I think they had several roles in the past, and as Mr. Vinay and you have rightly pointed out, for the first time, reality is meeting aspiration, and that is that HR really is now becoming the business partner. There were all these conversations about how HR is strategic in nature, but that was more in terms of a conversation. But today, there is no choice but to treat them as a business partner, and they themselves obviously have to grow up into that role of understanding that today employee engagement spend is obviously going to ramp up, because as leaders you realize that making sure everybody is clued into what is the purpose, what is the broader mission, and what is the way we integrate is going to become a very critical anchor for companies to move their business goals forward. So therefore, possibly lower fixed pay and higher variable pay in terms of desired productivity and targets, redeployment and reskilling and competency mapping, and seeing how we can turn roles around wherever it is required, and making sure that if there are retrenchments, there are also outplacement and career transitioning services which are also available. So companies like Randstad have a huge role here, because when you reach out, you're not just reaching out to help a business, but you're actually reaching out to help human beings with talent. And your role, your function as a company which is fulfilling a major societal obligation today is actually going to go up. So companies like yours are going to be very much in play, and they are going to deliver an important societal goal.
Thank you, Professor Raghu, and absolutely agree, especially with the last point. I can tell you, Randstad as the leading #1 company in the world in staffing and recruiting, we look at it as a vocation. I mean, we help create gainful employment, which has a huge impact not only on one person's life, but on the people around them. And our math says one person getting gainful employment influences 5 people in the inner circle. So in India alone, we put 60,000 people to work every day. So that's 300,000 people immediately that we're impacting. Of course, you can extend it out further to different layers. It becomes much more. But it's also about self-esteem. It's also about hope for the future. We all know what gainful employment does for someone in the family, but also organizations that are navigating through. These are companies that have worked long and hard to build their presence and to build their organization, and we need to help them navigate through the crisis. And I can tell you, I talk with a lot of CEOs and of course heads of HR and business leaders in general about how to handle the workforce element here. I mean, when you, for example, if you're in manufacturing and you have been shut down for 7, 8, 9 weeks and you've had 0 revenue coming in, if you're in fast-moving consumer goods and retail and you've had 0 revenue coming in, how can you carry a workforce? How can you carry those costs? And so what I'm seeing with leading companies, the companies that are showing that agility, that adaptability, they're protecting their people at all costs. At one point, though, a decision needs to be made. And what I'm seeing with some companies, they're rethinking their whole strategy, and this is being led by HR. This is where the role of the HR leader, I think, is changing. We're thinking about something I would call workforce strategic planning or workforce planning. If you look at the pie of your workforce right now, and what percentage of that pie is permanent core full-time employees versus temporary workers versus contracted workers versus outsourced, a function that's outsourced. And of course, let's add in the last element, which is the gig worker, right, which is extremely fluid. So a lot of organizations are coming to us now for advice on how to do that, and we're able to support because we provide labor in different shapes and sizes around the country and of course around the world. So this is what I'm seeing. The role of HR is now rethinking the footprint of the workforce. And I would take it one step further, the physical footprint. We talk about accommodation on a P&L, your accommodation expense is a huge one for any company. And so rethinking that, this new way of working has implications to the physical footprint as well. So it's an interesting time for HR leaders. I would say it's on one hand, crisis brings opportunity. This is a tragic disease or virus, I would say. On the other hand, for HR leaders, it provides an opportunity to really reinvent what it means to be an HR professional. Absolutely agree. Strategic as well as commercial, a true business partner, making courageous decisions. Let's go on to the next questions. We have a bunch here and a lot coming in as I'm speaking as well. Thank you for many of you who are sending in questions as well. So we have a question, it's connected to the question on how to ensure employees are able to return to full bandwidth and full impact after the crisis begins to settle. And we have a question about reassuring employees, two questions actually, and ensuring that they feel safe. And this came up in the last webinar about this idea of healing. How do we help people heal? Because there are some studies that show that up to 30% of employees will not be able to return to the workplace because of fear, because of signs of something like post-traumatic stress disorder, just that fear of when you've been in lockdown mode for a long time and you've been told don't go outside because it's dangerous and don't get close to others because it's dangerous. And then companies are saying, okay, we're back open for business, come back. I think we underestimate the impact of that and how tough that will be for some people. So a couple of questions which I'll club together. From Vinay Kumar, the CHRO of Newberg Engineering. The question is, what measures can you take to address the uncertainty in the minds of employees, especially when we start looking at going back to work? And also from Pratik Nagar, the CMO of Boozy, what steps are organizations taking to ensure the mental and emotional well-being of employees? We'll start with Vinay. What are you seeing out there, Vinay?
So I think maybe I'll answer the first part, but there are two different parts, right? What measures to what uncertainty? I think it's about clarity and communicating. Leaders need to be saying what they don't know, even giving some short-term direction, and being very transparent and honest, and saying that, look, we don't know, we don't anticipate, or we do anticipate at some stage letting people go. But to what Professor said, we'll provide the best care to the employees in terms of outplacement, outskilling, whatever there might be. In terms of mental and emotional well-being, I want to just go back to the framing that you did, right? When employees returning to full bandwidth. My first question is, we need to challenge why are employees, actually, why are we assuming they're returning to full bandwidth? We have a whole host of number of employees who are working at 100% bandwidth from home. What we're hearing is everyone's got longer days, they're not able to switch off. So, and they're just doing more connections and more calls. So in terms of mental and emotional well-being, I think the role of HR and business leaders is giving employees time or putting in ways of working that says, we will not have calls after this time. We will not be sending out emails at midnight and expecting people to respond. Being aware of this, that your personal space is now your workspace and has become your new workplace, and helping these employees draw some boundaries and lines in that space will help their emotional well-being. I'll give you a very practical example. I'm standing and doing this meeting. The challenge is a lot of organizations invested tremendous amount of infrastructure for ergonomic keyboards and ergonomic chairs in the office. That's not helping employees any shape or form today when they're working from home. So can organizations think about shipping those keyboards and chairs to employees' homes? So that'll again help the mental and emotional well-being. Just giving that little bit, yes, we care about your ergonomics, not just in the workplace, but with your new workplace, your workspace will bring it there as well. And that shows.
Yeah, that's a really good point. We talk about compassion and so on, but it also means, understanding that working from home is not necessarily easy, as many of us have. And I look at my own calendar, I'm guilty of it. I mean, I wearing two hats, working for a global company. The rest of the world comes awake when I'm in late afternoon in India, so that it extends to the evenings. And it's important to make time to breathe, to think, to reflect, and so on, but also to take care of yourself physically and mentally. And we've done informal surveys with colleagues, and I'll be in town halls with our colleagues across the country, and I'll ask a fun question, and maybe I'll ask everyone on this one, although you can't raise your hand, but think about this: are you getting fitter as a result of this crisis, or are you getting, let's say, well, I'll use the word fat. I mean, and I say that with all respect. Are you getting bigger? In other words, have you put on weight, or have you lost weight, or have you simply maintained during this crisis? The crisis is an opportunity, actually, to become more fit, physically and mentally. And I know, Vinay, even before we went on live here today, you were talking about your daily routine. I mean, would that be your normal daily routine pre-crisis?
I wish it could have been, but I would have been on the road traveling all the time. And no,
Yeah.
so I'm using the opportunity to get fitter.
Well, why don't, while we've got you here, and proof that Vinay is getting in shape, and I've known Vinay a long time, I think you're looking very fit, Vinay. Why don't you share with everyone what your simple routine is that you're doing during the crisis?
Well, 30 to 45 minutes of walking in the morning around my apartment building and climbing up my 12 floors back to my apartment, doing some stretches and some weights, etc. So investing at least 45 minutes to an hour every day, which I would not have had that discipline because traveling, late nights, jet lag, all of that. So I've got the luxury of being in one place.
Yeah, all that time spent in cars and traffic and Bangalore traffic and beyond, of course, waiting in airports and so on, probably eating the food that would not be as healthy if you were at home, you know, able to care for yourself. It all adds up. So, you know, I encourage everybody. I'm a big fan of fitness, and I really believe that leaders, to be at their optimum, we'll say bandwidth, full bandwidth, you need to take care of yourself first, mentally and physically. It's very important so you can operate at full capacity, no different than a professional athlete. We are all, in a way, like professional athletes. In order to give our best performance and add the most impact, we need to be at our best. So yeah, I encourage everyone to make this a high priority moving forward. There's a saying that sitting is the new smoking. It's been proven that sitting actually leads to more health problems than smoking, which is really interesting when you think about it. So we need to be aware of that. Our body is not made to sit. It's actually made to move. It's unnatural for us. It's an unnatural position alone. And Vinay, to your point about ergonomics, isn't that interesting how much money we've all spent, us included, in outfitting our brand new office, like, and our more than 4,000 offices around the world? It makes you think about how we can care for our people to provide an environment where they can thrive. And that environment might not be an office. It might be working from home. And it makes us rethink about, well, how can we enable our employees to work from home and be at their optimum and to perform at full bandwidth? And then that kind of, again, makes us rethink our whole idea around accommodation. Professor Raghu, what are your thoughts on this? Again, the uncertainty in the minds of employees, ensuring the mental and emotional well-being of employees. What are organizations doing? What can organizations do?
Exactly. So I think this is something which I truly believe in, and starting from HR, which is always in touch with people, plus the leaders at various levels. We are very much like the emotional thermostat, like the thermostat in an air conditioner. And what we say and what we do actually will set the emotional temperature of people who are working with us. So if we are going to be anxious, and if we are going to stress, and if you're going to be inducing fear much more than what people can actually handle, it's not going to help anybody, because, you know, if the level of anxiety goes up, it actually is inversely proportionate to the level of cognition people can have and the level of thinking that people can actually bring to bear on what they are expected to do. So performance actually is strangely correlated to emotional well-being and a feeling of support of somebody who's actually backing you up all the time in terms of whatever you're doing. So a atmosphere of a emotional cocoon, so to say, which really steps up to meet the kind of emotional and mental challenges that people are experiencing, and not rationalizing with it, but actually helping them live through it, is something I think is very important. And I am very fond of saying that in a rock climbing exercise, it is the belayer, the guy who holds on to the string, which actually is tagged on to the climber, who actually decides what happens to the climber in his next step. So we are all in that frame, and I think that's a very important value that we bring.
Thank you. Yeah, some Really good points. And if I look at what organizations are doing right now, EAPs, for example, the employee assistance programs, having counselors ready and able. Some companies are even hiring now, bringing people on board to support because they're aware that some people have a hard time going back to work post-crisis, as I mentioned earlier. This is something we don't know a lot about yet. We don't have anything, at least in modern history, we can refer to where we're in a forced, rather sudden lockdown, where, as I said earlier, people have been told to stay home, and then suddenly they're told, okay, come out. And then what are the implications and ramifications of that? So I think, you know, organizations who are working hard to future-proof and be ready for the bounce back when it comes. Of course, it will be gradual. These are organizations that need to think about the support that's going to be needed and provided to people. I think also technology. You know, we've been forced. There's an interesting thing I read yesterday, which is, you know, who has led digitization in your company? You think about that. Who is responsible for leading digitization? Some will say the CIO, the head of technology. Some will say the CFO. Some will say the CEO. I'm a big fan of tech and tech for touch. But we know that actually the leader of digitization in organizations has been COVID-19.
Yes,
so
exactly.
We have all been forced to, whether we like it or not. Some of us like it, by the way. We like this opportunity. We embrace it to you know, become digitized, to embrace AI, to you know, to really go digital and use tech for touch, as we say at Randstad. But some of us, especially the more traditional companies, this has been a painful experience. It continues to be a difficult experience. And I think companies who are now, instead of resisting it, embracing it, will also be ahead of the game. Let's go back to my point about what Darwin said, this adaptability. If you're a company that for many, many years did it one way, but the world has changed, if you're prepared to do it another way, you'll be future-proof. So I think it's very important that we all kind of rethink, you know, how we do things, why we do things the way we do. The other term that came up, and I think is very important, we talk about this. We need to talk about leadership now in crisis. And you know, Professor Raghu, last webinar, you provided a wonderful list of leadership competencies, which was really popular with the viewers at that time during crisis. I think many of those are absolutely relevant post-crisis. But I'd like to hear from both of you on, you know, what you really think it means to be now a leader, especially as we start to move forward into this world, this new world, where maybe we're living with a crisis rather than post-crisis, because I think, you know, we're hearing that COVID will be around for a while. So what does it mean to be a leader in this new world? And, you know, what are the qualities that leaders will need in this new world? Who would like to give that one a shot?
Okay, I will attempt that, and I'm very sure Mr. Vinay has points which are extremely practical. So one of the things which leaders have been set in a context is one of trying to provide stability and control, right? So that has been a predominant emphasis when you are in leadership positions, that you've got to be offering stability, you've got to be managing things, you've got to control things. And here is a time, as we rightly said, that COVID-19 is the one which leads digital transformation or any change for that matter. Here are times which are exactly the opposite of stability and control, and that is about flexibility and discretion. So in other words, when we have been totally hierarchical, and hierarchy actually meets the market in terms of a company interacting with the market, we are now thrown in a situation where, like paratroopers, these fellows have information on the ground and we have the big picture. So in other words, hierarchy and market interface has now been slowly changed into what we will call as a creative entrepreneurial mindset, where risk-taking and being autonomous where it is required in terms of a response is met by an organizational leadership which is more collaborative in nature, more trying to build cohesion and trying to build loyalty, and is nurturing the process of bringing people together. So in other words, where earlier it was all about structure, control, process, not that it has gone away, but the emphasis now is more on bringing in cohesiveness, in bringing that transaction, like as you rightly said, bringing the big picture in when you are strewn in multiple directions, in multiple areas, And you cannot always think about what is it that we are heading for and what is it that we are trying to address. This kind of a change in terms of stability and control as a clear focus to flexibility and discretion is something I think leaders and organizations have to really marry.
Thank you, Vinay.
Yeah, I think, in the first webinar, I quoted Martin Luther King's, one of his quote that's attributed to him, "Only in darkness can you see stars," right? And this is the opportunity for leaders to shine. And really, from my perspective, what I'm doing, and I'm coaching some of the leaders as well, is agility. Being slow, responsive is not good because the environment is changing so fast. So you want agile leadership. The second is, I think you pointed it out earlier, Paul, courageous, make those decisions, but do it in such a way that's compassionate on the people that you're making those decisions on, right? So the compassion element as well. And the fourth one I would just say is also vulnerable. It is okay to go out and ask for help. It is okay to go and seek a peer group or other stakeholders that can support you through these tough times, because it's not leadership in isolation. It's you may actually have to pick up the phone and speak to a competitor you would never ever speak to before, because there's an opportunity in this fast evolving world that you may have to end up collaborating and sharing workforce or moving some of your workforce to them if that's an area they're going into. So being vulnerable and being able to say, look, guys, I need help here is very, very important. So I would say those four traits.
Yeah, absolutely agree. I want to share a book off my shelf behind me as I was listening to you talk. One book that's guided me, and I'm revisiting it now. It's a follow-up. So this is from Jim Collins, who wrote Good to Great, which I shared in the last webinar. This is a book built to last. Absolutely recommend that leaders read this book, especially now. It's relevant right now. It talks about preserving the core, protecting, defending and protecting the core of who you are as a company, as an organization, as a leader, but also stimulating progress. So activating that seeking mind in the organization. There's going to be two types of response. We talk about fight and flight to the crisis. One is to flee, to panic, and to be kind of overtaken by fear. The other one is to embrace the challenge. So we can either run away from it or embrace it. I think crisis brings opportunity. This is absolutely a tragic situation we're in. On the other hand, for leaders, it's an opportunity to put on new muscle, and we'll call it new leadership muscle, new kinds of muscle we haven't used in the past as leaders. And here's an opportunity to do it. And organizations that did that were built to last. So these are the future-proofed organizations. Some great examples of here. They're companies that endured crisis, that reinvented themselves many times over history. If you study companies that have been around for 100 years or more, and that's something that I'm doing right now. I'm trying to understand, how can a company continue to thrive? You think about 100 years in our modern history, all the things that have happened, and yet these companies continue to thrive and be stronger than ever. And why is that? One common denominator is they constantly reinvented themselves. They preserved the core, the values, their greater purpose, what they stood for, but they reinvented themselves. They embraced every change that came and they leveraged it and turned it into opportunity. There's also in this book, the BHAG, right? The big, hairy, audacious goals, talking about in crisis, how many companies actually accelerated because they set big, let's call them crazy goals. When people heard the goals, they said, you're nuts. But of course, when you're ambitious and you set big, hairy, audacious goals, the worst thing that can happen is they don't come true. The best thing is they happen and they come true, and you future-proof your organization. So one book I recommend everybody read, Built to Last. After I hang up here, I'm going to read the chapter on preserve the core and accelerate. So let's move on. Thank you very much for that. We have a lot of best practices. In fact, when we set up this webinar, we did something different. We actually asked registrants to share some best practices that they're doing in their own organization. And I have to tell you, I have a huge amount of best practices here. And I think what we can do after this webinar is compile these and share them with you all who have attended, because there's some great stuff. And I do believe, none of us are smarter than all of us together, right? We can learn from each other. As Vinay said, ask for help. That's why we're here today, by the way. We learn a lot from each other, from best practice. Let me just read a couple of these, and I'll come to Professor Raghu and Vinay if you have any comments as well. So this is from Monali Mahajan, the HOD of legal, head of legal. They already have, so right now, things that they're doing, they have SOPs for corporate and the mall operations and deal with the new normal to make sure that they're implemented as we move forward. This is, sorry, In Orbit Malls, India, right? And he's in Mumbai. So SOPs are already being created. Absolutely, you're gonna need to have processes. If I go back to the military example, you know, and I have to tell you, I'm not a huge fan of SOPs. In good times, I prefer creativity and agility and common sense. But in times like this, your SOP keeps you on track. It keeps you lean, it keeps you sharp, and it leaves no gray zone. So that's a good one. This is an interesting one here as well. I'd like to hear your comments, gentlemen. This is from Momita Basu, the head of HR at PS Group in Kolkata. Says, we are encouraging our employees to upskill and upgrade themselves to best utilize this lockdown period. So this period where we're not in the office, we're encouraging people to really develop themselves. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely, this is the agility of the workforce, right? You can only be agile if you're learning new things. So I think that's great. The only thing I would add there, what employees want is some direction in terms of what to upskill and what to upgrade themselves on. You know, which direction would the business be going? So maybe even just 4 or 5 teams is good, and then leave it to employees to go and find courses, online stuff that they can do to do it. And obviously see if you find some way to reimburse them. Most of my clients who use online learning platforms and have had them for years are telling me that they've never ever seen utilization rates as high as ever before. For the first time, they're seeing the systems and servers crashing, be it, and I'm sure LinkedIn Learning is very happy, and Coursera and all Skillsoft and all of these folks. But I think what employees really want from the organization is what areas can I make myself relevant in for the future? I think that's going to be very important to provide direction.
Yeah, good point, Vinay. I'm just comment on that. What we're seeing in the market and what we see from the data that we're finding is that, you know, what are the skills of the future? Well, we already knew before the crisis that anything related to AI, to cloud, to data science, and so on was going to be in demand, but even more so now. It's been absolutely accelerated and turbocharged as we move to this contactless world that Professor Raghu talked about. Contactless has a lot of implications. So if you were just to think about that word contactless, and then think about your daily interactions pre-COVID, and how many contact points you would have in a typical day. Take that to a typical week, take that to a typical month, and now go back and say, how do you make each of those contactless or as contactless as possible? It actually provides a lot of opportunities. There will be new roles and jobs that we haven't even heard of yet that will be outcomes of this crisis. So back to you, Professor Raghu. What are your thoughts on this, on upskilling and upgrading yourself through this crisis?
I think HR has a major role in partnering with business leaders and figuring out what is it that is required, and then putting that out into your internal network systems for people to opt out and look at online programs and the way to certify themselves. And this is another way of actually building morale in the organization, because as we all know, we don't have work up to capacity in most places. And in other places, they are all overworked. So it's a complete, it's a complete seesaw. Either there is too much or there is not enough. And therefore, this is a complete learning environment, mediated, of course, by technology, because it is all online. And it's very important for HR to get onto the competency function and to see where the company is heading and what is it that is actually required, and getting volunteers from the workforce to opt for reskilling and retooling themselves.
Thank you. We have from Amita Joseph from HSBC, VP of IQA Policy and Training here in Bangor, has said that we're letting employees come in a phased manner with flexi hours. This is an interesting point. Conscious of their stamina, physical and mental, and supportive on the home front. So they're learning about, you know, the situation that they actually face on the ground in their homes, because everyone's in a different situation and we all carry different challenges and burdens. So HSBC doing some interesting things, also conscious of, you know, the condition of people. So some more here. We've got a lot of SOPs, a lot of guidelines, and so on. One here from Arun Ramraj, the general manager of HR at Rialto Enterprise in Chennai, saying we're ensuring that they're safe at home. We're also mapping out the transit routes of all of our employees and to ensure that the workplace is free of the virus. So they're mapping out the transit route to make sure that the route itself is also a safe zone. And of course, sharing knowledge of preventative measures, so regular newsletters and so on to ensure that everyone is well aware of things they can do to stay safe as well. That goes back to the communication piece we talked about earlier. It's very important, right? We're seeing a lot of comments here from companies saying they're going to be phasing in, they're preparing to phase in. Certainly no one is saying we're going to go right back to business. It's interesting because the government in India and other countries have, as well, when they start to loosen the restrictions, have said a percentage. For example, in India, we're saying 1/3. And I know, Vinay, you're less than 1/3 in your office today, of course. You've decided to do that as a leader, but other companies are deciding to go to the 1/3. Less are doing that. I think a manufacturing environment is a very different story. You can't run an assembly line with 1/3 of the people on the actual line because every station needs to be filled in order to assemble the product. But in a service environment, you know, it can be done. We're also seeing, I'll give you one example here. We talk about 5% per week. So this is from Mihir Badkamkar. He's the director at ATC Global in Mumbai. So that 5% per week, they're increasing the workforce based on the predictions of the business needs. They're also, of course, working virtually, allowing people to work virtually, flex timing. They're rethinking KPIs, rethinking goals. That's an interesting observation. I think that many leaders need to take into account that maybe we need to redefine what success is. Certainly, you know, if you're in the world of sales, then it's a measurable outcome. That won't change too much, but the how may change. But certainly throughout the organization, there's a chance to rethink goals and deliverables as well. Yeah. So a lot of best practices here. Actually, too much to share all on this call here today because we're coming to 12 o'clock here in India, and so we're going to come.
Mr. Paul, I have a small thing to share.
Sure.
I just found something very interesting, and I just thought that maybe there are not a whole lot of people who are quite aware of what's happening in terms of this company called Kaprun, which I think is an Israeli-based company, which has actually brought out copper-based microbial technology on masks, which captures 99.85% of aerialized viruses. And if there is a way companies can actually source this mask in bulk and hand it over to their employees, because if the copper texture is able to capture, and they can use it 3 times over before they throw it. This is a sure shot way of making sure not just about health, but also this fear about what really happens when you start engaging physically in an environment.
Yeah, thank you. That's a good example. And there's lots of crisis brings opportunity. A lot of companies now are looking at ways that they can support this new world that we will have moving forward, not just of work, but in general. Dr. Fauci in the US, who was advising the president, of course, has said that we need to do away with certain cultural habits that we have, like shaking hands. That alone, he said, would reduce the risk of spreading viruses in general. So it's interesting. Now, you know, it first was taken as tongue-in-cheek, but people are starting to realize that this may be a very practical suggestion moving forward. There'll be a lot of things that will change, obviously. We're about to wrap up here. I'd like to come back to you, gentlemen. This crisis has given birth to some new catchphrases. We've heard a lot. New normal was one of those, of course, but we were talking about some earlier. Any catchphrases or any kind of phrase that you kind of are sticking in your mind that you think are worth mentioning today and sharing with everybody? Vinay?
I would say Zoom done, Zoom overdone, Zoom overdosed, technology overdone. There's a new definition to quiet time, which means you know, digitally disconnected time. I think those are all terms that will become the next things that we need to use. And I think organizations need to create some digital disconnect times for the workforce.
Some of my colleagues in Europe, they're very clever with these kinds of auto response messages that you send when they're away, right? And it's interesting you mention that because we don't see a lot of people taking days off during this. I look at the number of days off requests I would get during, pre-COVID versus now. I mean, people are not taking days off. There's this assumption that you can't take a day off when you're working from home. You absolutely can, and you need to sometimes. But the auto responses are things like, thank you for your message. I am purposefully not looking at my computer for the next 2 days. Decompressing from digital, and we'll see you in 2 days. I mean, those kinds of messages are coming up more. Professor, what are some that you're fond of?
Yeah, so I just thought that you will come up with this question. So I kind of put some things together and let me see if I'm able to show you that. It is basically about I don't know where exactly it is, but the idea here is that one is actually able to look at the power within yourself instead of the problem outside you. So it's a PWY is greater than the POY. In other words, that one has to look at oneself as a factory which will come up with unique solutions, and one has to believe in yourself more than anything else. And there are no ready-made solutions available. It's all about how you process and you believe.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you. And several golden nuggets I've taken away from today's discussion. Thank you. We are absolutely all paratroopers. We need to be paratroopers with compassion. We need to be ready for a new world. I don't think it'll be a new normal. It requires strong leadership and courage, of course, along the way. So thank you both again for joining the third in the trilogy. And I must say, as I look at our number of attendees, well over 500 that have stayed with us for this full hour plus now. Thank you all so much for joining us. After this webinar, you will receive an email which has a recording, of course, of the webinar, along with some key points and any references we would have made to today, books or whatever we've talked about. You'll have those as well. We hope that this hour was worth your time, that you, again, have some takeaways that you can apply in the journey ahead. I wish you all to stay safe, stay healthy, and of course, stay connected. And we look forward to life. Well, I won't say post-crisis, life in the new world. All the best, and thank you, Professor Raghu, Vinay, for joining.
Thank you.
Great discussion. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day. Stay safe.
Thank you.